let's talk about Against the Giants by Gary Gygax. This is an RPG review, a retro review, and the purpose is to consider this as a game aid, not as a piece of fantasy literature, but as something you use when playing Dungeons and Dragons, or if I was doing something for a different RPG, for that RPG. So with that expectation set, Gary Gygax is one of the co-creators of Dungeons and Dragons, along with Dave Arneson, and Gygax was really the bigger rule writer of the two. Many of the rules we still use today in the 5th edition draw very close parallels or very obvious lineage from Gygax's rules in the original D&D and then the 1st edition and thereafter AD&D, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. This was an early module. We use module usually to mean adventure, something you run for your players that's not written by you. This was an early module, but not the first. Tomb of Horrors, Lost Caverns of Sojkanth, Expedition to the Barrier Peaks had all been released in 75 and 76, 1975, 1976. D&D is old, but not much older than that. But it is amongst the first. It was published in 3 smaller units in 1978. It was compiled in 1981 into this triple volume, which I own. It's called G1-3 Against the Giants, i.e. Module G1, Module G2 and Module G3. And it's really the original base assault module. The first time that there was a publication that said there's some bad guys who live here, you have to go and storm that base in an explicit way, where that's the way you were thinking. Even if there was always a bit of a flavour of that in other adventures from the early days. It's also, Gygax really coined virtually every original type of adventure. Not every, but nearly every. Tomb of Horrors is the original puzzle dungeon. Lost Caverns of Sojkanth is the original sprawling cavern crawl. Expeditions to the Barrier Peaks is full of funky weirdness, investigation, sci-fi fantasy crossover. And G1-3 is the Storm the Fort originator. The 3 modules are linked, or they can be linked, though in basically convenient ways. There's a teleport stone, more or less. That's the way it works. At the end of each module, there's a teleport stone to the next thing. It highlights an expectation, really, of the 3 being run as a single adventure or at a long tournament or event. You're spending a weekend and playing all these adventures in about 25 or 30 hours worth of play. But they can be hived off, they can be used in, you could say, I just want the Hill Giant steading, but with a different connection to the world. That's very easy to do. They can be connected in a different way, if you want it to be like that. The first, the steading of the Hill Giant Chief, is about a Hill Giant base during a feast that you have to get into. The second, the Glacial Rift of the Frost Giant Jarl, is a kind of crazy cold wilderness area where there's caves and so on. And the third, the Hall of the Fire Giant King, is a fortress, a proper castle fortress held by a very, very powerful Giant King, who's really the ruler of all these other evil giants you're having to deal with. And G3, the Fire Giant King, is about half the module. The other 2 are a quarter. The Fire Giant is about a half. So let's talk about its pros. Let's discuss what's good about it. One, it has very clear maps. Some people would say, well, it's not very artistic, but that's the point. The fact it's very usable. By the way, you might wonder about the blue thing. The blue thing, I think, was so that they couldn't be photocopied easily. It was DRM. But maybe I'm wrong about that. But the clarity of the maps is good, not bad. The lack of detail and dressing on the maps is good, not bad. And there's a variety of maps. I suppose there are 6 maps across the 3 different dungeons. So the maps are good. When you look at them, you're like, oh, I can see that this is this kind of base. The key, what we call the key, the description of the adventure, is very terse on the whole, but it's also very complete. I'll give an example of what it looks like. You can see those are each rooms, those numbered things. And for instance, here's one. 12 Lower Bone Cave. This place has many bones and skulls littering it, and it is the lair of 5 ice toads. Hit points 37, 31, 26, 22 and 19. These creatures feed on the leavings in Area 11. They have but one treasure, a naturally shaped piece of reddish-purple amethyst, base value 5,000 gold pieces, which resembles a toad. They have it on a protuberance in the middle of their cave, and it is worshipped by them as a god. The toads rest on small ledges from 8 to 12 feet above the cave floor, and they will hop down and savagely attack anything which touches it. That was, by the way, I chose that at random, and it says something else, that these feel like there's a purpose to the room. They are organic, and that's true there. Those ice toads live in that room, and they have their one treasure, and in their kind of semi-sentient way they worship it because it looks a bit like them. And so it's organic, you know why they're there, and it fits into a wider organic environment. It's not what we call a monster hotel. It's not something where you just have random monsters living next to each other because that's a fun challenge, but it's what you might call Gygaxian naturalism. This heightened, slightly magical, realist way of monsters and other things living near each other in a way that kind of makes a weird sense. Maybe it's not how actual ecology would work, but there's a sort of functional fictional ecology going on. It doesn't feel completely random. Moreover, by the way, that random example is very rich, isn't it? Gygax is not, at first glance, always the most obvious funky guy, because there's a certain dry technicality about the writing, communicating exactly what you need to hear. But at the same time, how rich is that imagery? You know, you go into this frozen room, and you know how it's connected to the previous room, room 11, and you know that as you come in there, you can imagine describing to your players that they see these weird ice toads, seemingly genuflecting to a lump of very expensive looking amethyst. So even if the players wouldn't necessarily go in there and find it, given in this edition the amount of gold you took out of the dungeon created your XP, your experience points, the player's going to be like, that's expensive, these things are worshipping it, is there something we can do? You know, how are we going to get that out of there? So it's very rich as well, and this is full of great moments like that. I'll actually list a few more in a moment, but I'll say first, there's also good tactical advice where it's necessary, talking about how defenders will react, who they'll call for help, what tricks they'll use when the attackers, i.e. the players, get to their base. What are the tactics they'll use? That's good. That's a lot more realistic than lots of adventures. When you're fighting intelligent enemies, they should act intelligently. And there are so many iconic moments. I've just read one completely at random, and I think it's really fun. But there's the iconic moment of how you sneak into the hill giant steading during the feast, and you think, okay, well, how are we going to keep under cover? Are we going to pretend to be slaves? How are we going to get past these partying giants? There's a whole thing about like how you have to deal with the giants' kids and stuff. There's in the bottom of G1, in the bottom of the hill giant steading, there's also this strange, almost out of place but strangely not out of place, weird shrine, the weird abandoned temple. You've just been wandering around dealing with these giants and their slaves, and you're going into the semi-abandoned mines and stuff underneath, and then you come across in a passage blocked by stones. The room is of faintly glowing purplish green stone, carved with disturbing shapes and signs which seem to stare out from the walls and columns, to shift positions when the watcher's back is turned. Touching the walls makes one chilled, and contact with the pillar causes the one touching it to become nauseous. At the far west end of the temple is an altar of pale, yellow-grey, translucent stone. It feels greasy to the touch, but it has no effect upon those who touch it. Behind the altar is a flight of low, uneven steps which lead to an alcove with a concave back wall of purplish-black, glassy-appearing substance. If any creature stands before this wall and gazes upon it for one round, a writhing amorphous form of sickly mauves and violets will be seen stretching its formless members toward the viewer. The sight causes the creature seeing it to have a 50% chance of becoming insane. If the creature does not go insane, a touch upon the curving will cause a scarab of insanity to appear upon the altar for the first one so doing, and a 5,000 GP gem for the next. Again, Rich and clear. It's pretty clear what's going on there. It's quite very atmospheric even in the writing. This isn't fantasy fiction, but it gives the DM who's reading it, the dungeon master, a sense of what's going on. And then there's this test. You look at it. Can you withstand the madness? And if you do, you get a reward. Or you can if you're bold enough to touch the curving. And that just appears out of nowhere. It's this intrusion of weirdness into the base assault. And there are many other awesome moments. There's the Storm Giantess in the Frost Giant prison who you can free. There's the awful, tricksy Giant Queen in G3, who's one of the best villains of the whole piece. There's the sneaky dwarf advisor to the Fire Giant King. There's the Titan prisoner in the Fire Giant Keep. There's another weird temple. This is the thing, that there's this theme of weird temples that is on Gygax's mind, and only pays off slowly over another couple of modules, completely separate from these. And then finally there is the Drow embassy, the Dark Elves, who had never appeared before, and may now be a cliche to many of us, may now be a cliche to many of us who play D&D, but had just appeared, these strange evil elves. And they, with their dark purple skin and their matriarchal society and their strange magic. And most notably, there's Iclavdra, the evil Drow priestess with her awful rod of tentacles, which paralyzes those she strikes. So you've got a lot of iconic, both original moments that never come up before, but also just very well realized moments that you can imagine as you're reading it, what's going to happen at the table when you play. We should talk about some cons as well. The text is difficult for old people. It's very small. It's a young man's game reading these old modules. There aren't many illustrations, and for those of us who are maybe a bit more visual, we're going to have to really dig in to the illustrations there are to get an idea of what's going on. It's a prose work, basically. The maps are there as technical aids, and there's a few pictures, and I'd say that they are pretty nice pictures. I wouldn't say they're at all bad, but just to help you visualize a few key scenes, that's all. There's also a question with these older modules of expectation and education. Basically, the expectations we have matter. If you want a story to watch as a player, or as a DM you want a story to kind of narrate, or you want a fun bit of novelistic reading, you'll be disappointed. This is a real product for the table, and for that table being one where people play and interact with the world. Again, there's an issue of education. Sounds funny, but let's say someone really wants to read Chaucer but knows no Middle English. They read the Canterbury Tales and they enjoy it, but they only half understand it, and maybe they don't enjoy it, therefore. They're frustrated. Well, it's a bit like that. You may, if you're mostly used to reading more modern products, only half understand this. Basically, what you need to know first is the kind of game that's being presented. This is a technical manual for people who half know what's expected. In fact, you can see a lot of the variation in early D&D experiences being to do with whether people know what's expected, what's really going on. The horror stories about Tomb of Horrors are all to do with basically people not understanding. It was a high-level skill test for experienced players who really wanted to prove they were the very best, where D&D has an element of skill in it to being a good player, which may be controversial. I don't think so, but that's an expectation. So here, the idea that you are going to be cunning, the idea that this is about exploration, the idea that this gold is there as a measure of your achievement, you get it out and it represents how deep into the dungeon you got successfully, so how much you've learned, and that's your experience points. Unless you know those expectations, you'll read this and find information strange or very narrow, not giving you what you think you need. But when you understand, all these creatures are meant to be talked to and negotiated with, often there are detailed instructions on how characters, particularly important ones, will deal with negotiation. Once you know that, this is a lot easier to understand. But I sympathise with those used to a much more verbose form of writing, where there's a lot of detail, some of which probably isn't even needed, but who might come to this and think, what on earth is going on? What kind of alien text is this? What's that Slavic hieroglyphic manuscript which no one can decode? Or what is this manuscript, you might say? But basically, with those cons of cultural distinction, and also, you know, just the fact it's got small text and it's not heavily illustrated, and you may need to do a bit of adaptation to your own setting. With all that borne in mind, nonetheless, these are very good modules. They are some of the best ever published. You can run it at the table pretty easily. The first two modules are very short. They're 7 pages each, and they're much better than many longer modules now. When you realise that in the TSR and early Wizards days of late second, early third edition, you might have a 32-page scenario, 32-page module, which had less content than these 7-page modules. And that was a short module, 32 pages, but somehow, even with all those extra pages, it had less content. They are packed with content. So you can learn them quickly, you can run them quickly if you are willing to put a bit of work into them. But the influence is what's more important. They're very good modules. We can run them now. They are not outdated. Brilliance does not fade. But the influence is the more important point, really. This started off the whole base assault genre. Every time you've had to not just crawl through a dungeon, but attack an enemy, this was the original. That's important. And it defines even more than the modules released in the same period a certain writing style. It's perhaps the best executed set of modules up to this point, for the clarity of the prose and the usability of the key, the prose, with the maps, and the general sense that there's this story connecting all these things and there's a developing world. So that's, you know, as I say, that's very influential. And also it brings in for the first time the kind of elder god, the strange gods, this Lovecraftian influence that Gygax loved, which has come in and out of D&D since, but is a very important influence itself. It also brings in the Drow for the first time, one of the most iconic villains, and here, strange and new, even to me, who knows all about them. Strange and new to read about them here. And finally, at the end of the module, it leads into the Underdark. It leads into the dark underworld where the players are going to have to find out about the Drow plot and finally defeat it, which leads into the D series, D1-3. So that's what I thought. If you've read the module, what did you think? Tell me in the comments.